Sometimes the heart calls us to help a creature in need, never knowing how profoundly that act of kindness will change our lives. Louise Hartwell felt that pull when she found a shivering puppy on the mountain road, its small body trembling against the Colorado cold. She brought it home to her cabin, thinking she was giving it shelter and warmth. The puppy seemed grateful, following her around the house and curling up by the fireplace. But the next morning, something was different. The little dog began acting strangely, scratching at certain floorboards and whining at her grandmother's old wooden chest. It would sit by the window at night, staring into the dark forest, as if watching something she couldn't see. What had Louise really brought into her home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Louise Hartwell had never imagined that at 42. She would find herself living alone in a cabin perched on the side of a Colorado mountain, with only the wind through the pines for company. 3 years had passed since David's sudden heart attack had left her a widow, and 2 years since she'd packed up their suburban Denver life and retreated to the property her grandmother had left her. The inheritance had surprised everyone, including Louise herself. She'd barely known the stern old woman who had visited only twice during Louise's childhood, bringing strange gifts and speaking in riddles about family responsibilities. The cabin sat on 40 acres of rugged mountain terrain, surrounded by towering evergreens and connected to the outside world by a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy snows. Louise had chosen this isolation deliberately, seeking refuge from the well-meaning but suffocating sympathy of friends and neighbors who didn't understand that sometimes grief needed space to breathe. Here she could work as a freelance writer without interruption, crafting articles and stories while the mountain seasons painted the landscape in ever-changing hues. Her daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise over the eastern peaks. She rose early, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, as David used to tease, and settled at her computer by the large window that faced the valley below. The town of Cedar Ridge nestled in the hollow like a collection of toy houses, its main street barely visible from her vantage point. Twice a week, she made the 20-minute drive down the mountain for supplies, exchanging pleasantries with the handful of locals who had become familiar faces in her solitary existence. Doc Peterson ran the only veterinary clinic in town, a weathered man in his 70s whose gentle hands and patient manner had earned the trust of every rancher and pet owner within 50 miles. Sheriff Reynolds, younger than Louise by perhaps 5 years, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen enough of human nature to approach most situations with cautious optimism. Tom Bradley owned the general store, an establishment that seemed frozen in time with its creaking wooden floors and shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle. These people had welcomed her with the reserved friendliness typical of mountain communities, polite but not intrusive, helpful when needed but respectful of privacy. They understood that folks came to places like Cedar Ridge for reasons they didn't necessarily want to discuss, and Louise appreciated their unspoken agreement to let her heal at her own pace. The cabin itself had been a revelation. Built in the 1940s from local timber, it possessed a solid, enduring quality that spoke of careful craftsmanship. The main room combined living space and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows on 3 sides that brought the forest indoors. A loft bedroom overlooked the main floor, while a small office, where Louise now spent her working hours, occupied what had once been a storage room. The furnishings were simple but comfortable, and Louise had added little to what her grandmother had left behind. Among those belongings, the locked wooden chest had always puzzled her. Made of dark oak with iron hinges gone black with age, it sat beneath the office window like a silent guardian of secrets. Louise had searched through her grandmother's papers for a key, but found nothing. The chest was solidly built, and she had hesitated to force it open. respecting both the craftsmanship and whatever privacy her grandmother had intended to preserve. Now, watching the small brown puppy circle the chest with intent focus, Louise felt her curiosity rekindling. The little dog, she had started thinking of it as male, though she hadn't yet made the drive to Doc Peterson's clinic for confirmation, seemed drawn to the chest with an intensity that went beyond normal canine interest. He would sit before it for long minutes, head tilted, as if listening to sounds only he could hear. The puppy's appearance had been as unexpected as it was timely. Louise had been returning from her weekly supply run, her truck loaded with groceries and a new batch of writing assignments, when she spotted the small figure huddled beside the road about halfway up the mountain. The evening light had been fading, and for a moment she'd thought it was a piece of debris blown by the wind. Only when she stopped and stepped out did she see the small brown form trembling against the coming night's chill. He was perhaps 3 months old, with the oversized paws and soft features of a puppy still growing into himself. His coat was a rich chocolate brown, marked with white patches on his chest and one front paw. But it was his eyes that had captured Louise's attention, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding uncommon in such a young animal. When she approached, he hadn't run or cowered, but had simply watched her with what appeared to be patient expectation, as if he had been waiting specifically for her arrival. The drive up to the cabin had been silent, except for the puppy's quiet breathing from the passenger seat, where he sat with remarkable composure for a supposedly stray animal. He showed no signs of malnutrition or neglect, his coat healthy and his manner confident rather than fearful. Louise had puzzled over this as she carried him inside, wondering if he belonged to one of the scattered neighbors she rarely encountered. She had prepared a makeshift bed near the fireplace and offered him water and some leftover chicken from her dinner. He had accepted both gratefully, but without the desperate hunger she would have expected from a lost animal. Instead, he seemed more interested in exploring his new environment, sniffing carefully at corners and doorways, pausing longest at the wooden chest. That first night, Louise had slept better than she had in months. The presence of another living being in the cabin, even one so small, had somehow eased the weight of solitude that had pressed upon her shoulders. She woke to find the puppy curled at the foot of her bed, as if he had appointed himself her guardian during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The morning had brought the first signs that this was no ordinary rescue. While Louise prepared breakfast, the puppy had wandered the cabin with purposeful steps, investigating areas he had only briefly examined the night before. He spent considerable time near the chest, occasionally placing his small paws against its side and whining softly, not the distressed cry of a lost animal, but something that sounded almost like communication. Louise found herself studying the chest with new attention. She had always assumed it contained personal papers, or perhaps keepsakes too private for casual examination. Her grandmother had been a woman of few words and many secrets, someone who spoke in implications and meaningful silences. Louise's mother had often complained about the old woman's cryptic nature, dismissing her grandmother's stories about family history as the wanderings of an overly dramatic mind. But now, watching the puppy's intense interest in the chest, Louise began to wonder if those dismissed stories might have contained more truth than anyone had realized. Her grandmother had lived on this mountain for over 50 years, long enough to become part of its history. The local families who had known her spoke of her, with a mixture of respect and wariness that suggested she had been more than just another reclusive mountain dweller. The puppy's behavior during his second day in the cabin only deepened the mystery. He displayed an intelligence that went beyond typical canine understanding, seeming to anticipate Louise's movements and responding to her unspoken moods with uncanny accuracy. When she sat down to work, he settled quietly nearby, never interrupting but always present. When she prepared meals, he watched with interest but never begged or demanded attention. Most remarkably, he appeared to understand the boundaries of acceptable behavior without any training from Louise. He showed no interest in chewing furniture or exploring forbidden areas, conducted himself with a dignity that seemed almost human in its restraint. It was as if he had arrived already, knowing the rules of civilized coexistence. Yet it was his continued fascination with the wooden chest that convinced Louise something deeper was at work. Throughout the day, she caught him sitting before it, sometimes placing his small nose against the wood, sometimes simply staring as if waiting for it to reveal its secrets. His behavior suggested not mere curiosity, but recognition, as if the chest held something he had been seeking. By evening of the second day, Louise had made her decision. The puppy's presence had already changed the atmosphere of the cabin in ways both subtle and profound. The silence no longer felt heavy with loneliness, but rich with companionship. The room seemed warmer, more alive, as if the small creature had awakened something that had been sleeping in the mountain. If he was meant to be here, and Louise was beginning to believe he was, then perhaps it was time to unlock the secrets her grandmother had kept sealed away. The chest had waited long enough. Tomorrow she would take the puppy to see Doc Peterson, partly to ensure his health, but mostly to begin asking the questions that might lead to answers about why he had appeared on her mountain road at precisely the moment when her solitary life had begun to feel less like healing. Solitude and more like voluntary imprisonment. The puppy seemed to sense her resolve. As Louise prepared for bed, he took up his position near the chest once more, but this time his vigil felt less like waiting and more like anticipation. Whatever secrets lay locked within the dark oak, whatever purpose had brought this remarkable animal to her door, Louise sensed that her quiet life on the mountain was about to become far more complicated and far more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. Louise woke before dawn to silence. The absence of sound struck her as strange. No wind through the pines, no settling of the cabin's old timbers, not even the puppy's gentle breathing from his place by the fireplace. She lay still in her loft bed, listening to the unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the windows like something waiting to be let inside. When she climbed down to check on the puppy, she found him sitting motionless before the wooden chest, his small form rigid with attention. The chest itself appeared unchanged, still locked, still positioned exactly where it had always been beneath the office window. But something in the air around it felt different, charged with potential energy that made the hair on Louise's arms stand up. "What is it, little one?" she whispered, approaching slowly. The puppy didn't acknowledge her presence, his dark eyes fixed on the chest's iron lock with unwavering focus. Louise knelt beside him and placed her hand on the chest's smooth oak surface. The wood was warm to the touch, warmer than the cool morning air should have allowed. As her palm made contact, she felt a subtle vibration, as if something deep within the chest was responding to her presence. The puppy finally moved, rising on his hind legs to place his front paws against the chest's side. To Louise's amazement, she heard a soft click, the sound of metal moving against metal. The ancient lock mechanism turned, apparently operated by some hidden spring or catch that the puppy's small paws had activated. "How did you know to do that?" Louise breathed, but the puppy had already stepped back, his tail wagging slowly as the chest's heavy lid creaked open on hinges that should have been too stiff to move after decades of disuse. The interior smelled of cedar and age, but also something else, a faint herbal scent that reminded Louise of her grandmother's rare visits, when the old woman had seemed to carry the essence of mountain meadows in her clothing. The chest was deeper than Louise had expected, and carefully organized with items wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in small wooden compartments. On top lay a hand-drawn map, its edges yellowed, but its lines still clear. Louise lifted it with trembling fingers, recognizing her grandmother's careful script along the margins. At the top of the document, someone had written, "Mining claims and underground systems, Cedar Ridge Mountain, 1894. Below that, in different ink and what appeared to be a more recent hand, "For Louise, when the Guardian awakens you, the path will be revealed. The map detailed an intricate network of tunnels beneath the mountain, far more extensive than Louise would have imagined. The passages branched and connected like arteries, with various chambers marked and labeled in symbols she didn't recognize. Most intriguingly, several locations were circled in red ink, with notations that made her pulse quicken. Sealed 1894, do not enter. The Heart Chamber, Sacred Ground, and Guardian's Watchpoint. One tunnel system ran directly beneath her grandmother's property. A thick red line traced its path from an opening marked just behind the cabin to a large central chamber deep within the mountain's core. Next to this chamber, someone had drawn a careful star and written, "The source, contained but not destroyed." Louise spread the map on her kitchen table, using coffee mugs to hold down its corners. The puppy jumped onto a chair to study the document with the same intense focus he'd shown the chest. When Louise pointed to the marking near the cabin, the puppy's entire body seemed to vibrate with excitement. Returning to the chest, Louise discovered additional treasures that transformed her understanding of her grandmother's life and her own inheritance. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, bore the inscription, "The Guardian's Record, maintained by the Hartwell women since 1894. The first entry, written in careful Victorian script, introduced her to an ancestor she had never truly known. October 20th, 1894. I, Margaret Hartwell, accept the sacred trust passed to me by Grey Wolf of the Ute people, witnessed by the mountain spirits and sealed by my own willing sacrifice. What the miners disturbed in their greed must be contained. The darkness they awakened feeds on fear and hatred, growing stronger with each soul it corrupts. I will stand guard so that others may live in peace," Louise read, with mounting wonder as the entries detailed her great-great-grandmother's role in sealing what Margaret called an ancient malevolence within the mountain's depths. The journal spoke of collaboration with indigenous spiritual leaders, of rituals performed at specific times to maintain the binding, and of the price each guardian paid for accepting the responsibility. Each generation of Hartwell women is born with the potential to serve, one entry explained. But the mountain chooses its guardian, sending a messenger when the time has come to pass the trust from mother to daughter. The messenger appears as a loyal companion, usually in the form of a dog, whose spirit is bound to the sacred duty and whose wisdom guides each new guardian to accept her destiny. Louise looked at the puppy, who was watching her with those impossibly knowing eyes. "You're the messenger, aren't you?" she said softly. "You came to awaken me to something I never knew I was inheriting." The puppy tilted his head, and for a moment Louise could have sworn she saw something ancient and wise looking back at her, something far older than his apparent youth, something that had been waiting patiently for her to understand, as if responding to her realization. The puppy jumped down from the chair and walked to the cabin's back door, looking over his shoulder with clear expectation. Louise understood. He wanted to show her the entrance marked on the map. She dressed quickly and followed him into the morning forest. The puppy led her up through pine trees behind the cabin, moving with confident purpose along paths that seemed to exist only for him. Louise struggled to keep up as the small animal navigated through underbrush and over fallen logs, never hesitating about direction or destination. After 30 minutes of climbing, they reached a clearing Louise had never noticed, despite having lived on the property for 2 years. The space felt different from the surrounding forest, quieter, more focused, as if it served a specific purpose. In the center, partially concealed by decades of accumulated pine needles and carefully arranged stones, was an opening in the mountainside. The entrance was larger than Louise had expected, easily big enough for a person to enter upright. The air that emerged from within carried the scent of deep earth and something else, something that made her instincts whisper. Warnings about disturbing things better left alone. Puppy sat beside the entrance with formal dignity, as if presenting something of great importance. Louise approached cautiously, feeling the temperature drop as she neared the opening. The darkness beyond the entrance seemed deeper than mere absence of light, somehow more substantial, as if it possessed weight and purpose. "This is where it begins," she said, understanding flooding through her. "Whatever my grandmother was protecting, whatever responsibility she left me, it all centers on what lies beneath." The puppy's soft whine confirmed her understanding. He approached the entrance, but did not cross the threshold, instead looking back at Louise with an expression that mixed patience with urgency. The message was clear. Her time of ignorance was ending. She could no longer live on this mountain as simply another person seeking solitude. She was the inheritor of a sacred trust, the next in a line of women who had sacrificed normal lives to protect their community from something most people couldn't imagine. As they stood there in the growing daylight, Louise became aware of subtle changes in the mountain around her. The morning bird songs seemed muted. The air carried a tension that pressed against her skin like humidity before a storm. Something that had been sleeping was beginning to stir, responding perhaps to her discovery of the journal and map, or to the presence of the spirit guide who had been sent to awaken her to her destiny. The puppy approached her side, leaning against her leg with surprising warmth. Louise knelt and gathered him into her arms, drawing comfort from his solid presence, even as her mind reeled with the implications of what she'd learned. "I don't know if I have the strength for this," she admitted. "My great-great-grandmother sounds like she was made of stronger stuff than I am." The puppy licked her cheek gently, his dark eyes conveying reassurance and confidence that Louise wished she could share. In that moment, she understood that strength wasn't a prerequisite for accepting the guardian's role. It was something that would grow from the accepting itself. The entrance to the mountain's secret heart gaped before them, a doorway between the ordinary world and something far more complex and dangerous. Louise knew that once she crossed that threshold, her quiet life of healing solitude would be transformed forever. She would become not just a woman living alone on a mountain, but a keeper of ancient secrets, a guardian of forces that required constant vigilance to contain. With her great-great-grandmother's journal as guide and the spirit puppy as companion, Louise realized there was no path forward but down into the mountain's depths and into a destiny that had been calling her name since the moment of her birth, waiting patiently for her to become ready to hear its voice. The morning after discovering the mine entrance, Louise drove down the mountain with her grandmother's journal secured in her bag and questions burning in her mind. The puppy rode in the passenger seat with calm dignity, as if he understood the importance of their mission to gather information from the town's long-time residents. Doc Peterson's veterinary clinic occupied a converted farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, its white clapboard siding weathered by decades of mountain winters. Louise had visited twice since moving to the mountain, once for supplies when her truck wouldn't start, and another time to ask about wildlife precautions. Both times, she had sensed that the elderly veterinarian possessed the kind of deep local knowledge that came from treating animals. Across an entire valley for most of his adult life, the waiting room was empty when Louise entered with the puppy in her arms. Doc Peterson emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a towel and smiling with genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Well now, Miss Hartwell, don't see you in town too often." His eyes moved to the puppy with professional interest. "And who's this little fellow? Looks healthy enough, though there's something unusual about his eyes. Almost seems like he's listening to conversation he understands." Louise settled into one of the worn chairs, the puppy calm in her lap. "I found him on the mountain road 3 days ago. No collar, no signs of distress, but he acts like he's been waiting for me specifically. I was hoping you might know if anyone in the area has lost a puppy recently." Doc Peterson approached slowly, extending his hand for the puppy to sniff. The small dog accepted the examination with remarkable composure, never flinching or showing the nervousness typical of animals in veterinary settings. "Can't say I've heard of anyone missing a pup," Doc Peterson said thoughtfully. "But I'll tell you something curious. This little guy reminds me of stories my father used to tell about the dogs that lived up on your mountain." Louise's pulse quickened. "What kind of stories?" The veterinarian settled into the chair across from her, his expression growing more serious. Dad worked the mines back in the 1920s after the big disaster, but while some of the smaller operations were still running. He always said there were special dogs up there, animals that seemed to understand things regular dogs didn't. Said your great-great-grandmother always had one as a companion, and that somehow they lived longer than normal dogs should. Louise kept her voice carefully neutral. My family doesn't talk much about that time period. I'm trying to piece together what life was like for my ancestor. Margaret Hartwell was respected around here, Doc Peterson said slowly. Also a bit feared, if I'm being honest. People said she had an understanding with the mountain that went beyond normal folks' relationship with the land. He paused, studying the puppy, who was watching the conversation with the same intense attention Louise had come to expect. Your great-great-grandmother lived alone up there for 40-some years after the mine disaster. Never remarried, rarely came to town except for essential supplies. But whenever there was trouble in the valley, bad weather, missing livestock, even once, when the Henderson boy got lost in the woods, she always seemed to know about it before anyone else. Louise felt her heart racing, but forced herself to remain casual. The mine disaster, that was in 1894? That's right. 7 men died when they broke through into some kind of natural cavern. Her official story was unstable rock conditions, but the survivors told different tales. Doc Peterson's voice dropped lower. They said the men found something down there that shouldn't have been disturbed. Strange sounds, unnatural cold, and all the animals in the area started acting spooked. The puppy shifted in Louise's lap, pressing closer against her as if offering comfort or support. She stroked his soft fur while processing the veterinarian's words. What happened after the disaster? That's when your great-great-grandmother stepped in. She volunteered to live near the sealed entrance and watch for signs of instability. The mine owners were happy to have someone take responsibility they didn't want, and the townspeople were relieved to have Margaret handling something they didn't understand. Doc Peterson stood and walked to his window, looking out toward the mountains. My father always said the troubles stopped completely once she took up her watch. No more strange sounds, no more spooked animals, no more bad dreams plaguing the miners' families. Whatever she did up there, it worked. Louise carefully considered her next question. Did your father ever mention what methods she used? How she managed to stabilize whatever was causing the problems? The veterinarian turned back to her, his eyes sharp with sudden interest. That's a very specific question for someone just learning about family history. Louise realized she had revealed more curiosity than a casual inquiry should warrant. She decided to take a calculated risk with partial truth. I found some of her papers when I was cleaning out old family belongings. There are references to responsibilities and duties that I don't understand. I'm trying to piece together whether they were just the ramblings of an isolated woman or something more significant. Doc Peterson returned to his chair, leaning forward with obvious interest. What kind of references? Louise pulled the journal from her bag, opening it to one of the earlier entries that wouldn't reveal too much supernatural detail. Things like maintaining the watch, protecting the binding, and ensuring the containment holds. The language suggests she was doing something more complex than just monitoring for rock slides. The veterinarian read the passage she showed him, his expression growing more serious with each word. When he looked up, Louise saw recognition in his eyes. Miss Hartwell, I think you've stumbled onto something that a few of us old-timers have wondered about for decades. Your great-great-grandmother wasn't just watching for mining hazards. She was maintaining something that required ongoing attention. Something that kept the entire valley safe from whatever those miners disturbed. He paused, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. There are stories, passed down through families who've been here since the mining days, about why certain areas of the mountain should be avoided, why livestock won't graze in particular meadows, why some winters bring bad dreams that seem to spread from house to house until they just suddenly stop. Louise felt a chill of recognition. You think these stories are connected to whatever my great-great-grandmother was doing. I think your ancestor was part of something bigger than most people understood. And I think He gestured toward the puppy, who was watching their conversation with unnatural focus. "I think this little fellow might be connected to that same something." The puppy tilted his head, as if acknowledging the accuracy of Doc Peterson's assessment. Louise realized that the veterinarian's knowledge might be more extensive than he was willing to admit directly. "Doc Peterson, if I told you that I might be inheriting more than just property up there, that there might be responsibilities I'm not sure I understand, what would you advise?" The elderly man was quiet for a long moment, studying both Louise and the puppy with careful attention. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone of someone choosing his words very carefully. "I'd say that some inheritances come with obligations that can't be shirked, even if they seem impossible or frightening. I'd also say that your great-great-grandmother chose her solitude for good reasons, and that anyone following in her footsteps should be prepared for a life that looks different from what most folks consider normal." He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a small silver object that he placed in Louise's hand. It was a locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful, decorated with symbols that looked Native American in origin. This belonged to Margaret Hartwell. "She left it with my father before she died, asking him to keep it until someone from her family came looking for answers. She said whoever inherited her property would eventually need it for protection." Louise opened the locket to find a photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, standing beside a dog that could have been the puppy's twin. The image confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Her connection to the mountain's secrets ran deeper than coincidence or chance. "There's something else you should know," Doc Peterson said quietly. "Your great-great-grandmother didn't die of old age like the official records claim. She died protecting this valley from something that tried to break free from whatever containment she'd created. The locket was found clutched in her hand, and my father always believed it had saved her life more than once before that final encounter." Louise closed the locket and slipped its chain around her neck, feeling an immediate sense of warmth and protection as the silver settled against her skin. The puppy's tail wagged approvingly, as if he recognized the significance of her accepting the protective talisman. As she prepared to leave, Doc Peterson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Miss Hartwell, if you decide to take on whatever responsibility your ancestor left behind, remember that you don't have to face it alone. There are people in this valley who understand more than they usually let on, and we're prepared to help if the need arises." The drive back up the mountain felt different with the locket around her neck and new knowledge filling her mind. The puppy sat quietly in the passenger seat, but Louise could sense his approval of how the conversation had gone. She had found an ally in Doc Peterson, someone who understood the reality of what she was inheriting and who would support her when the time came to fully accept the guardian's role. The locket's weight against her chest felt like an anchor, connecting her not just to her great-great-grandmother's memory, but to a legacy of courage and sacrifice that stretched back generations. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with tools and knowledge that had been preserved specifically for her use. Louise spent the rest of the morning reading her great-great-grandmother's journal from cover to cover, absorbing details that transformed her understanding of both her family's history and her own purpose on the mountain. The entries painted a picture of a woman who had accepted an extraordinary responsibility with remarkable grace, documenting not just the practical aspects of maintaining the binding, but also the emotional cost of a life dedicated to vigilant solitude. "The darkness speaks to those who carry anger in their hearts," Margaret had written in 1897. "It whispers promises of power and revenge, feeding on resentment until good people become instruments of malice. This is why the guardian must live apart, not from fear of the entity itself, but from the corrupted souls it creates among those we might otherwise love." The puppy had settled beside Louise as she read, occasionally raising his head when she reached passages that seemed particularly significant. His presence was comforting, but also unsettling in its implications. According to the journal, each guardian spirit companion remained with her throughout her service, sharing the burden of watchfulness and providing guidance when human understanding proved insufficient. By afternoon, Louise had made her decision. She needed to see the heart chamber for herself, to understand fully what she was inheriting before she committed to accepting the guardian's role. The puppy seemed to sense her resolve, rising from his resting place and padding toward the door with expectant purpose. The entrance to the mine system was exactly where the map indicated, hidden behind the cabin in a natural depression that made it nearly invisible from any angle except direct approach. In daylight, Louise could see that the opening had been carefully maintained over the years. The stones around its perimeter were clean of moss and debris, and the wooden framework supporting the entrance showed signs of recent attention. The puppy entered the tunnel without hesitation, his small form quickly swallowed by the darkness beyond. Louise followed, using her cell phone's flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The tunnel was wider than she had expected, tall enough for her to walk upright and broad enough for two people to pass comfortably. The walls showed the careful workmanship of experienced miners, with timber supports placed at regular intervals and drainage channels carved along the floor. As they descended deeper into the mountain, Louise became aware of subtle changes in the atmosphere. The air grew warmer rather than cooler, and she began to detect a faint luminescence emanating from somewhere ahead. The puppy's pace quickened, his excitement evident in the quick wag of his tail and the forward thrust of his eager nose. After 20 minutes of steady descent, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber that took Louise's breath away. The space was enormous, easily the size of a cathedral, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows beyond her flashlight's reach. But it was the chamber's central feature that captured her complete attention, a formation of natural crystals that rose from the floor like a frozen fountain of light. The crystals pulsed with inner radiance, their surfaces reflecting and amplifying each other's glow until the entire formation seemed to breathe with life. The light was not harsh, but warm and welcoming, filling the chamber with a sense of peace that made Louise want to sit and rest in its presence. She understood immediately why her great-great-grandmother had referred to this place as the heart of the mountain. The puppy approached the crystal formation with reverent caution, his manner transformed from playful companion to something approaching worship. As he drew near the crystals, they responded to his presence, their glow intensifying until the entire chamber was illuminated as brightly as day. Louise walked slowly around the formation, marveling at its natural beauty and the sense of ancient power that seemed to emanate from its core. According to her grandmother's journal, this was a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected, a natural nexus that had drawn both protective and malevolent forces for countless generations. It was then that she sensed she was not alone. The presence made itself known gradually, beginning as a subtle shift in the air pressure, then developing into something Louise could feel, watching her from the chamber's darker corners. Unlike the warm, welcoming energy of the crystals, this attention carried weight and hunger that made her skin crawl with primitive alarm. The puppy growled softly, his hackles rising as he positioned himself between Louise and whatever lurked in the shadows beyond the crystal's light. His protective stance confirmed what Louise's instincts had already told her. They had encountered the very force her ancestor had spent her life containing. A whisper reached her ears, so soft she might have imagined it, carrying words that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and speak directly to her deepest fears. So young to bear such burden, so alone to face such darkness. I could ease your pain, give you back what death has stolen. Louise's heart clenched as images of David flooded her mind. Not memories of his final moments, but visions of what their life together might have been if he had lived. She saw herself happy and fulfilled, surrounded by the family they had planned but never had the chance to create. The visions were so vivid, so achingly real, that for a moment she almost stepped toward the shadows where the whispers originated. The puppy's sharp bark broke the spell, snapping Louise back to awareness of where she was and what was trying to influence her thoughts. She looked down at her spirit companion, seeing in his dark eyes the ancient wisdom that had guided 4 generations of guardian women through similar moments of temptation. "You offer illusions," Louise said aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "My ancestors' journal warned me about your lies." The whispers grew more insistent, carrying undertones of anger that made the crystals flicker like candles in wind. But Louise had found her strength in acknowledging the truth rather than fleeing from it. David was gone, and no power on earth could truly restore what death had claimed. Her responsibility now was to protect others from the kind of loss she had experienced, not to chase impossible fantasies of recovery. She approached the crystal formation, following the puppy's lead. As her hand touched the nearest crystal surface, warmth flowed up her arm, not the desperate heat of fever, but the steady comfort of a hearth on a cold night. The whispers from the shadows faded, replaced by a different kind of communication that spoke through sensation rather than words. Louise understood, with clarity that transcended normal comprehension, that the crystals were not just beautiful formations, but active guardians themselves, sentient protectors that had been holding the malevolent presence in check for over a century. Her great-great-grandmother's binding had not simply trapped the darkness. It had created a partnership between human will and natural spiritual force, each strengthening the other in an ongoing dance of containment and vigilance. The puppy approached her side, his manner calm now that the immediate danger had passed. But Louise could see in his eyes that this encounter had been a test as much as a revelation. The entity they were charged with containing was patient, intelligent, and fully capable of exploiting human weakness when it found an opening. As they prepared to leave the heart chamber, Louise took one last look at the crystal formation, now understanding it as both beautiful sanctuary and prison. The binding her ancestor had created was strong, but not eternal. It required constant attention, regular renewal, and above all, the willing sacrifice of each guardian's normal life in service to something greater than personal happiness. The path back to the surface seemed shorter than the descent, as if the mountain itself was eager to help Louise process what she had learned. By the time they emerged into afternoon sunlight, she had made her decision with the calm certainty that comes from understanding one's true purpose. She was going to accept the role of guardian, not because she felt particularly brave or qualified, but because the alternative, allowing the contained darkness to escape and spread, was unthinkable. The mountain had chosen her, the spirit puppy had awakened her, and her great-great-grandmother's journal had prepared her. Now it was time to learn exactly what that acceptance would require. The days following Louise's first encounter with the contained entity brought disturbing changes to her mountain sanctuary. What had once felt like peaceful solitude now carried an undercurrent of watchful tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. The puppy's behavior reflected this shift. He had grown increasingly vigilant, often positioning himself between Louise and windows that faced the deeper parts of the mountain, his ears constantly alert to sounds beyond human hearing. Louise threw herself into studying Margaret's journal with new urgency, searching for practical guidance about maintaining the containment. The entries revealed a complex system of spiritual barriers that her great-great-grandmother had spent decades perfecting. According to the detailed notes, the binding wasn't a single spell or ceremony, but an intricate network of sacred markers, protective rituals, and ongoing vigilance that required constant attention to remain effective. The entity grows stronger in darkness and feeds on human emotions, Margaret had written in 1898. Fear, anger, and despair are like nourishment to it, allowing it to extend its influence beyond the physical boundaries of its prison. This is why the guardian must maintain emotional equilibrium, not from cold detachment, but from deep peace rooted in purpose and acceptance. The journal described 12 binding stones placed at specific points around the mountain, each carved with protective symbols and positioned according to both geographical features and spiritual energy patterns. These stones worked together to create what Margaret called a fence for the soul, barriers that the contained entity could not cross without weakening itself significantly. Louise realized she needed to locate and examine these binding stones to understand the current state of the containment. Using Margaret's hand-drawn maps and detailed descriptions, she began the challenging task of finding markers that had been placed over a century ago in a landscape that had undoubtedly changed. The first binding stone took her 3 hours to locate, even with the puppy's uncanny ability to guide her toward areas of spiritual significance. Hidden in a grove of ancient pines about a mile from the cabin, the stone itself was unremarkable to casual observation, a piece of local granite about the size of a watermelon, weathered by decades of mountain seasons. But as Louise approached it, she felt the same warm energy she had experienced with the crystal formation in the heart chamber. The puppy circled the stone 3 times in what appeared to be a ritual pattern, then sat beside it with evident satisfaction. Louise knelt and placed her hands on its surface, immediately understanding what Margaret had meant by anchors for the spirit fence. The stone was connected to something larger. She could sense other points of similar energy scattered around the mountain, forming a network that created boundaries the contained entity couldn't easily cross. But the connection felt weak, like a radio signal fading in and out. Louise realized with growing concern that the binding network might be deteriorating. After decades without proper maintenance, her fears proved justified as she systematically visited the locations marked in Margaret's journal. Of the 12 binding stones her great-great-grandmother had placed, Louise found only 8 still in their original positions and intact. 2 had been shifted by natural forces, one displaced by a fallen tree, another moved downhill by erosion. The disruption of their careful positioning had broken their connection to the spiritual network, creating gaps in the containment system. More troubling were the 2 stones she couldn't find at all. At one location, she discovered evidence of deliberate excavation, disturbed earth and broken rock that suggested someone had removed the binding stone entirely. The site felt cold and somehow wrong, as if the absence of protection had allowed malevolent influence to seep into the surrounding area. The most disturbing discovery came at the 7th binding stone location, high on the mountain's north face. The stone itself was present and properly positioned, but someone had carved additional symbols into its surface, crude markings that seemed designed to corrupt or redirect its protective energy. The alterations were recent, probably within the last few years, and they had transformed the stone's function entirely. Instead of radiating protective warmth, this stone now felt cold and aggressive. The puppy growled when he saw it, his hackles rising as he sensed the malevolent influence. Louise understood his reaction. The stone no longer served as part of the containment network, but as a beacon that weakened the overall system. As they made their way back to the cabin that evening, Louise couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. The sensation wasn't entirely new. She had occasionally felt watched since moving to the mountain, but now it carried weight and intelligence that made her primitive instincts scream warnings about unseen danger. The puppy stayed pressed against her side during the hike home, his protective instincts clearly activated by the same presence Louise could feel probing at the edges of her consciousness. By the time they reached the cabin, she had made a chilling realization. The binding stones hadn't been damaged by random natural forces. Someone with knowledge of their purpose had been systematically weakening the containment system. That night, Louise experienced her first direct assault from the contained entity. She woke to whispers that seemed to come from within her own mind, offering relief from the loneliness that had defined her life since David's death. The voice painted vivid pictures of companionship and love, promising that she could have Everything she had lost, if she would simply walk down to the corrupted binding stone and speak the words, it would teach her. The temptation was overwhelming in its specificity and emotional accuracy. The entity had studied her thoughts and feelings, learning exactly what she most desperately wanted. For several minutes, Louise found herself seriously considering abandoning her bed and following the whispered instructions. Only the puppy's sharp bark broke the spell. The small animal had positioned himself on her chest, his warm body anchoring her to physical reality, while his dark eyes conveyed urgent warning. Louise sat up abruptly, her heart racing as she realized how close she had come to becoming another corrupted servant of the imprisoned malevolence. The locket around her neck was warm against her skin, its protective properties apparently activated by the spiritual attack. As Louise touched the silver pendant, the whispers faded, replaced by a sense of clarity that allowed her to think rationally about what she had experienced. The entity was growing bolder in its attempts to influence her, suggesting that the deterioration of the binding network had given it more power to reach beyond its physical prison. If she didn't act soon to repair the damage, it might gain enough strength to corrupt others in the valley, turning friends and neighbors into willing agents of its release. Louise spent the remainder of the night reading Margaret's accounts of similar attacks, learning how her great-great-grandmother had defended herself against psychological manipulation and emotional coercion. The key, according to the journal, was maintaining absolute certainty about the entity's true nature. It was not a misunderstood force seeking freedom, but a malevolent intelligence that fed on human suffering and would spread that suffering as widely as possible if given the opportunity. By morning, Louise had made her decision. She couldn't repair the binding network alone. She lacked both the knowledge and the spiritual resources Margaret had possessed. But she knew where to find help. The journal made frequent reference to the Ute spiritual leaders who had guided Margaret through the original binding ritual. If their descendants still maintained traditional knowledge, they might be willing to help her restore the containment before it failed completely. The puppy seemed to approve of her decision, his manner becoming more alert and purposeful as Louise prepared for the journey that would take her away from the mountain, for the first time since discovering her inherited responsibility. Whatever answers existed, she would find them among people who understood that some things were too dangerous to release. No matter how persuasively they begged for freedom, the corrupted binding stone had shown her that time was running out. The entity beneath the mountain was actively working to weaken its own prison, and it was finding success through human agents who either didn't understand what they were serving or didn't care about the consequences. Louise's window for action was closing rapidly, and her next decisions would determine whether Cedar Ridge remained a peaceful mountain community or became ground zero for the release of something that should never have been disturbed. Louise spent the following morning creating a comprehensive map of the damaged binding network, marking each compromised stone with careful notation about the type of damage and estimated time of occurrence. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. The deterioration wasn't random, but followed a deliberate strategy designed to create the maximum weakness in the containment system. The missing stones had been removed from locations that would create the largest gaps in the spiritual fence. The corrupted stone was positioned at the network's most critical junction point, where its malevolent influence could disrupt multiple connections simultaneously. Someone with intimate knowledge of Margaret's binding system was methodically dismantling it. The puppy had grown increasingly agitated as Louise documented the extent of the damage. He would pace between the windows and the door, occasionally stopping to stare intently at the forest, as if watching for movement Louise couldn't detect. His behavior suggested that whatever forces were working against the containment were becoming bolder, possibly preparing for more direct action. Louise decided she needed to accelerate her timeline. The systematic destruction of the binding network indicated that her enemies, and she now had to think of them that way, were aware of her presence and actively working to prevent her from completing the necessary repairs. Every day she delayed gave them more opportunities to weaken the containment further. Using Joseph Crowfeather's instructions, she prepared the sacred materials needed to locate and replace the missing binding stones. The process required a combination of traditional dowsing techniques and spiritual sensitivity that pushed the boundaries of Louise's comfort zone. She had always considered herself practically minded, someone who dealt with tangible realities rather than mystical concepts. Now she found herself learning to sense energy patterns invisible to normal perception. The puppy proved invaluable as a guide, his supernatural awareness compensating for Louise's inexperience with spiritual practices. When she held the dowsing rod Joseph had provided, the small animal would position himself in ways that helped her interpret the instrument's movements. Together, they developed a system of communication that allowed them to work as an effective team despite the vast differences in their natures and abilities. Their first success came at the site where a binding stone had been deliberately removed. Following the puppy's guidance and the dowsing rod's subtle pulls, Louise located the original stone about 50 yards downhill from its proper position. It had been carefully buried under a cairn of ordinary rocks, hidden but not destroyed. As she excavated the binding stone, Louise marveled at the sophisticated nature of the sabotage. Whoever had moved it understood that destroying the stone completely might have triggered obvious supernatural consequences. Instead, they had displaced it just enough to break its connection to the network while keeping it intact for potential future use. The stone itself was larger than the others she had found, about the size of a small boulder, and covered with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. When Louise touched its surface, she felt a surge of energy that made her hands tingle. The stone had been separated from its proper place, but retained its essential power. Moving it back to the correct position required careful planning and considerable physical effort. Louise had to clear away years of accumulated forest debris, then use a combination of levers and sheer determination to shift the heavy stone into its original location. The moment it settled into place, she felt the change in the mountain's spiritual atmosphere, like the completion of an electrical circuit, restoring power to a system that had been running on reduced capacity. The puppy's reaction confirmed the restoration's success. His tail wagged with genuine happiness as he circled the repositioned stone, and his general demeanor became noticeably calmer. One major gap in the containment network had been repaired. However, their success came with disturbing evidence of ongoing interference. Louise found fresh footprints around the excavation site, boot marks that were definitely not her own, and too recent to have been left by casual hikers. Someone had been watching their work, possibly planning to undo their repairs or prevent future restoration efforts. The discovery of surveillance added a new layer of urgency to Louise's mission. She was no longer just racing against the natural deterioration of an ancient binding. She was actively opposed by human agents working to free the contained entity. The conflict had escalated from spiritual challenge to something approaching warfare. That afternoon, while searching for the second missing binding stone, Louise and the puppy encountered direct evidence of their opponent's activities. They discovered a campsite hidden deep in the forest, carefully concealed but clearly intended for extended occupation. The site contained sophisticated equipment, night vision goggles, communications gear, and detailed topographical maps of the mountain, marked with locations that corresponded exactly to the binding stone network. Most disturbing were the notebooks found in one of the tents, filled with careful observations about Louise's activities and detailed plans for disrupting her work. The handwriting was educated, the observations methodical, and the overall tone chillingly matter-of-fact about preventing her from completing the binding renewal. One entry, dated just 2 days earlier, read, "Subject continues research into traditional restoration methods. Spiritual guide animal shows increasing agitation. suggesting subject's work is having measurable impact on containment integrity. Recommend acceleration of disruption activities before full moon ceremony can be attempted. Louise realized with growing alarm that her enemies possessed knowledge that went far beyond casual interest in her activities. They understood the significance of the full moon timing, recognized the puppy's supernatural nature, and were tracking her progress with professional precision. More troubling was evidence that the camp had been occupied by multiple people working in coordinated shifts. This wasn't the work of a single corrupted individual, but of an organized group with resources and planning capabilities that suggested institutional support. The puppy's behavior while examining the campsite confirmed Louise's worst fears. He moved through the area with extreme caution, occasionally stopping to growl at specific locations where traces of malevolent influence lingered. Whatever force had corrupted these people had left spiritual residue that the sensitive animal found deeply disturbing. As they prepared to leave the hidden camp, Louise made a decision that went against every instinct for caution and secrecy she possessed. She gathered several of the notebooks and maps, taking evidence that would help her understand the scope of the opposition she faced. If her enemies were operating with this level of organization and knowledge, she needed to know exactly what she was up against. The return journey to her cabin was tense, with the awareness that they were likely being observed. Louise found herself checking over her shoulder repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that eyes were following their movement through the forest. The puppy stayed close to her side, his alertness confirming that the threat was real and immediate. That evening, as Louise studied the stolen notebooks by lamplight, she discovered information that transformed her understanding of the situation entirely. The group working against her wasn't motivated by simple corruption or promises of personal gain. They believed, based on extensive research into the mountain's history, that the contained entity was not malevolent, but wrongly imprisoned, a powerful force that could bring prosperity and renewal to the struggling valley if properly released. Their notebooks contained detailed arguments about the economic benefits of partnership with the mountain's spiritual consciousness, plans for controlled release procedures that would harness the entity's power for healing and prosperity, and philosophical justifications for overruling the decisions made by previous generations who lacked modern understanding. Louise realized she was facing opponents who weren't evil in any traditional sense, but genuinely believed they were working toward the greater good. This made them far more dangerous than simple servants of darkness. They had convinced themselves that their cause was righteous, making them immune to moral arguments and willing to use any means necessary to achieve what they saw as a positive outcome. The full moon was 6 days away, and Louise now understood that she was facing not just the challenge of repairing an ancient binding, but the active opposition of intelligent, well-organized enemies who would do everything in their power to prevent her from completing the renewal ceremony. The mountain's peace had become a battlefield, and she was running out of time to secure the weapons she would need for the coming conflict. Louise had spent 3 days successfully locating and repositioning 2 of the missing binding stones, working with growing confidence that she could repair the containment network in time for the full moon ceremony. The puppy had proven invaluable as a guide, his supernatural sensitivity leading them to stones that had been hidden or displaced over the decades. Each restoration brought a measurable improvement in the mountain's spiritual atmosphere, and Louise began to believe she might actually succeed in her inherited mission. That confidence shattered when she returned to her cabin on the 4th evening to find Sheriff Reynolds waiting for her. But not as she expected. Reynolds sat slumped in her kitchen chair, his face pale and his hands shaking as he gripped a cup of coffee she hadn't made for him. When he looked up at her entrance, his eyes held the haunted expression of someone who had awakened from a terrible dream to find it was actually reality. "Miss Hartwell," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, I need to tell you something that's going to be hard for both of us to accept. I've been working against you, but not by choice." The puppy's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the aggressive stance he had taken during Reynolds' previous visit, the small animal approached the sheriff with cautious concern, as if sensing a fundamental change in the man's spiritual condition. Louise remained by the door, unsure whether this was another manipulation or a genuine reversal. "What are you talking about, Sheriff?" Reynolds set down the coffee cup with trembling hands. "For the past 6 months I've been having dreams. At first, they seemed like ordinary nightmares. Dark figures, whispered voices, feelings of dread. But gradually they became more specific, more persuasive. The voice in my dreams told me you were dangerous, that you were planning to disturb something that would bring disaster to our community." He looked directly at Louise, his expression filled with shame and confusion. "I believed those dreams. They felt more real than my waking life. I started watching you, documenting your activities, even organizing other people to monitor your movements. The voice convinced me I was protecting everyone from a terrible threat." Louise felt her world shifting as she processed his words. "You were the one who moved the binding stones? Who corrupted the one on the north face?" "Not directly, but I facilitated it. I told certain people where to find the stones, convinced them we were preventing a catastrophe by disrupting whatever system you were trying to activate." Reynolds buried his face in his hands. "God help me. I even broke into your cabin and read your grandmother's journal. I photographed the maps and shared them with others who I thought were working to protect the valley." The full scope of the betrayal hit Louise like a physical blow. Reynolds hadn't just been passively corrupted, he had been actively orchestrating the opposition to her mission. The damaged binding network, the surveillance, the growing hostility from town residents, it all traced back to the sheriff's unwitting service to the contained entity. "What changed?" Louise asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" Reynolds looked up with eyes that held depths of horror Louise had never seen in another human being. "Last night the dream stopped lying to me. Instead of whispered promises about protecting the community, I saw the truth about what I've been serving." He stood shakily and walked to her window, staring out at the mountain's darkening slopes. "The thing beneath this mountain showed me what it really is, Miss Hartwell. It showed me what it plans to do if it escapes the containment your family has maintained. The corruption, the suffering it will spread, not just here but everywhere its influence can reach." Louise remained silent, recognizing the weight of confession and the courage it had taken for Reynolds to break free from supernatural manipulation that had controlled him for months. "It made a mistake," Reynolds continued. "It became so confident of success that it revealed its true nature instead of maintaining the deception. I saw towns consumed by hatred and violence, families turned against each other by whispers of suspicion and rage. I saw myself standing in the ruins of everything I've spent my life protecting, realizing I had been the instrument of its destruction." The puppy approached Reynolds and gently placed his head against the man's leg, offering the comfort that came from recognizing another victim of the contained entity's influence. The simple gesture seemed to break something in the sheriff, and he began to weep with the grief of someone who had discovered he had been betraying everything he held sacred. "How many others are involved?" Louise asked gently. "More than you might think," Reynolds replied. "The dreams have been spreading through the valley for months, always customized to each person's deepest fears and strongest protective instincts. Parents who believe they're protecting their children, business owners convinced they're safeguarding their livelihoods, elderly residents certain they're preserving community traditions." Louise felt the magnitude of her isolation growing with each revelation. The entity hadn't simply corrupted a few individuals, it had systematically turned the entire community into unwitting opponents of the very system that protected them. "There's something else," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tomorrow night, the night before the full moon, we were planning to stop you by force. The group believes you're going to perform some kind of dangerous ritual that will destabilize the mountain. They're planning to detain you until after the full moon passes, thinking they're preventing a disaster. Louise understood the brilliant cruelty of the entity's plan. By positioning her as the threat and the renewal ceremony as the danger, it had arranged for the community itself to prevent the very action that would maintain their protection. The full moon was the optimal time for renewing the binding. But if she was prevented from performing the ceremony, the containment would continue to weaken until it eventually failed completely. "Can you stop them?" Louise asked. Reynolds shook his head sadly. "I can try, but the dreams have been very specific about not trusting me if I seem to change my position. The entity apparently planned for the possibility that someone might break free from its control. If I suddenly start defending you, they'll assume I've been corrupted and will proceed without my involvement." Louise realized she was facing a situation more complex than simple opposition. She needed to perform the renewal ceremony while avoiding a confrontation with community members who genuinely believed they were acting heroically to protect their families and neighbors. "There might be another way," Reynolds said slowly. "The entity's control isn't absolute. It works through dreams and whispers, gradually building influence over time. But people who are fully awake and alert, especially in groups, are harder to manipulate directly. If we could somehow wake everyone up to what's really happening." Louise understood what he was suggesting. Instead of hiding from the community or fighting them, she needed to find a way to break the mass deception that had turned her neighbors into unwitting servants of the force they should fear. Most the puppy looked up at, both of them with an expression that seemed almost hopeful, as if he too recognized the possibility of transforming enemies back into allies. But with less than 36 hours until the full moon, Louise knew that any plan to restore community clarity would have to work quickly and decisively. The contained entity had played its hand with masterful deception, but Reynolds' awakening suggested that the truth was stronger than lies when people were forced to confront it directly. The question was whether Louise could find a way to reveal that truth before the full moon ceremony became impossible to perform. As the three of them, woman, man, and spirit guide, stood in the cabin's warm light while darkness gathered on the mountain outside, Louise felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She would have to risk everything in the next day and night. But for the first time since discovering her inheritance, she wouldn't be facing the challenge entirely alone. The night before the full moon, Louise worked by candlelight in her cabin, preparing for what might be her final attempt to complete the binding renewal. Sheriff Reynolds had left after midnight to return to town and attempt damage control, though they both knew his influence was limited by the entity's thorough corruption of community trust. Louise had spent the evening gathering the sacred bundle Joseph Crow Feather had described, a collection of items passed down through generations of guardians, each piece essential for the renewal ceremony. The bundle had been hidden in a secret compartment within her grandmother's chest, sealed with wax and marked with symbols that seemed to pulse with inner light when touched. The centerpiece of the collection was an ornate compass unlike anything Louise had seen before. Made of silver that had been darkened by age, but not tarnished, it bore intricate engravings of protective symbols from multiple spiritual traditions. But this compass didn't point toward magnetic north. Its needle swung toward sources of spiritual corruption, trembling and spinning when aimed at areas where malevolent influence was strongest. When Louise tested the compass by pointing it toward the mountain's depths, the needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that led directly toward the heart chamber. When she aimed it toward town, it pointed steadily toward Cedar Ridge, confirming that the entity's corruption had indeed spread throughout the community. Accompanying the compass was a letter from Margaret, written in her great-great-grandmother's careful script. To the guardian who must face the final challenge, the entity learns from each generation's efforts, growing more cunning with each attempt to escape. By the time you read this, it will have discovered how to turn community against guardian, using humanity's protective instincts as weapons of corruption. The compass will reveal the scope of its influence, but only the sacred fire can burn away its lies and restore clear sight to those it has deceived. Use this knowledge wisely. You will have only one opportunity to reveal truth before deception triumphs completely. The sacred bundle contained materials for creating what Margaret called the fire of clarity, a mixture of herbs, crystals, and blessed elements that, when burned during the full moon, would create smoke capable of breaking supernatural deceptions within a wide area. According to the detailed instructions, the fire had to be lit at the exact moment of the moon's fullest phase, and the guardian had to be willing to risk everything to maintain it until the smoke reached everyone under the entity's influence. Louise understood the sacrifice Margaret was describing. To create a fire powerful enough to break the mass deception affecting Cedar Ridge, she would have to channel her own life force into the flames. There was no guarantee she would survive the process, but without it, the renewal ceremony would be impossible to complete. The puppy had remained close to her side throughout the night, his presence both comforting and sobering. According to Margaret's notes, the spirit guide would share the guardian's fate during the final ritual. If Louise died creating the sacred fire, he would fade back into whatever realm had sent him. Their destinies were linked by bonds deeper than life and death. As dawn approached, Louise made final preparations for the day ahead. She packed the sacred bundle in a sturdy backpack, along with supplies that would allow her to remain at the binding site for extended periods. The ceremony itself would take most of the night, beginning at sunset and culminating at the moment of full moon. But first, she had to reach the ceremony location without being intercepted by well-meaning community members who believed they were preventing disaster. Reynolds had provided intelligence about the planned intervention. A group of nearly 30 people would be positioned along the main road leading up the mountain, with additional teams watching the hiking trails and forest paths. They intended to maintain a peaceful but firm barrier, preventing Louise from reaching what they believed was a dangerous ritual site. The irony was heartbreaking. The very people she was trying to protect were determined to prevent her from protecting them. Louise's advantage lay in her intimate knowledge of the mountain and the puppy's supernatural guidance. Together, they could navigate paths that weren't marked on any map, following deer trails and rock formations that would take them to the ceremony site while avoiding human observation. The journey began at mid-morning, with Louise and the puppy leaving the cabin through the back door and immediately entering the dense forest that stretched up toward the mountain's higher elevations. The pack containing the sacred bundle was heavy but balanced, and Louise had dressed in layers that would allow her to regulate body temperature during the long day and night ahead. The puppy led the way with confident purpose, choosing routes that avoided not only the main trails, but also the secondary paths where townspeople might have positioned themselves. His supernatural awareness allowed him to sense human presence from considerable distances, guiding them around potential encounters that could have derailed their mission entirely. As they climbed higher, Louise became aware of the mountain's changing spiritual atmosphere. The closer they got to the heart chamber, the more intense the conflict became between the contained entity's influence and the weakened binding network. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension, and Louise found herself stopping frequently to rest and center herself against psychological pressure that grew stronger with each step. The corrupted compass in her pack confirmed what she felt instinctively. The entity was marshalling all its power for a final assault on the containment system. If tonight's ceremony failed, there might not be another opportunity to renew the binding before it collapsed entirely. Midday brought them to a plateau Louise had never visited before, despite having lived on the mountain for 3 years. The area felt different from the surrounding forest, older, more sacred, charged with energies that made her skin tingle with awareness. Ancient pines grew in patterns that seemed deliberately arranged, creating natural boundaries around a clearing that would be perfect for the ceremony. The puppy confirmed her instincts by sitting in the exact center of the clearing and looking at her with obvious satisfaction. This was the place Margaret had chosen for the original binding ritual, and it was where Louise would attempt to renew the containment that had protected Cedar Ridge for over a century. Louise spent the afternoon preparing the ceremony site, according to Margaret's detailed instructions. The sacred fire had to be built in a specific pattern, using stones gathered from each of the binding sites around the mountain. The arrangement created a miniature version of the larger containment network, allowing the Guardian to channel energy through the entire system during the renewal ritual. As she worked, Louise felt the weight of approaching destiny settling over her like a heavy cloak. Everything in her life had led to this moment. David's death that had brought her to the mountain, her grandmother's inheritance that had revealed her true purpose, even her 3 years of solitary healing that had prepared her for the isolation the Guardian's role required. The puppy helped by carrying smaller stones in his mouth, his participation making Louise realize that she wasn't facing this challenge alone. Whatever happened during the ceremony, they would face it together as partners in a mission that transcended their individual lives. Evening approached with the inevitability of a tide. Louise could see the full moon beginning to rise over the eastern peaks, its light growing stronger as darkness settled over the mountain. In a few hours, she would light the sacred fire and attempt to break the deception that had turned her community into unwitting enemies. Success would allow her to complete the binding renewal and secure the valley's protection for another generation. Failure would mean the release of forces that could spread corruption and suffering far beyond Cedar Ridge's borders. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Louise made her final preparations for a ceremony that would determine not just her own fate, but the spiritual destiny of everyone she had come to care about in her mountain sanctuary. The sacred bundle lay open beside the prepared fire pit, its contents gleaming with inner light as the full moon's power began to build toward its peak. The time for doubt and preparation had ended. Soon, Louise would discover whether she possessed the strength and courage to fulfill the sacred trust that had been passed down through 4 generations of guardian women, or whether she would become the last in a line of protectors who had kept ancient darkness contained for more than a century, the ancient seal that had contained the malevolent entity for over a century lay cracked and failing in the deepest chamber of the mountain. Louise knelt before it in the flickering light of torches she had placed around the circular room. The sacred bundle spread open beside her as she prepared for the most dangerous part of the binding renewal ceremony. The seal itself was a massive stone carving, easily 8 feet across, covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight. Some of the markings were clearly Ute in origin, while others appeared far older, possibly from civilizations that had recognized the threat long before European settlers arrived in the valley. Cracks ran through several of the most important protective symbols, and Louise could feel malevolent energy seeping through the damaged areas like water through a broken dam. The puppy positioned himself at the chamber's entrance, his spiritual form now fully visible as he prepared to defend against any interference. His role during this phase of the ceremony was crucial. While Louise worked to repair the ancient seal, he would prevent the contained entity from launching desperate attacks that could disrupt her. In concentration at the critical moment, Louise began the restoration by placing her hands directly on the cracked stone, feeling the entity's immediate response to her touch. Waves of psychological assault crashed against her mind. Visions of David's death played in excruciating detail. Memories of her loneliest nights twisted into accusations of failure and worthlessness. Promises of power and companionship if she would simply step away and let the ancient prison crumble. "You cannot succeed where stronger women have failed," the entity whispered directly into her thoughts. "Your great-great-grandmother was a warrior, trained by indigenous shamans and hardened by frontier life. What are you? A widow who fled to the mountains because she couldn't face the world without her husband. Louise forced herself to focus on the physical work of restoration, using tools from the sacred bundle to clean debris from the seal's carved channels and prepare them for the renewal ritual. The entity's psychological attacks were vicious but predictable. It was trying to break her concentration. By exploiting her deepest insecurities and fears, Margaret had the support of an entire community, the voice continued. She worked with tribal elders who understood the old ways. You have nothing but a spirit dog and a handful of townspeople who tried to stop you just hours ago. How can you possibly succeed where you stand alone? But as Louise worked with the ancient stone, she began to understand something the entity hadn't anticipated. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't weaker than her great-great-grandmother. She was different in ways that gave her unique advantages. Margaret had possessed the support of a community, but Louise had experienced profound loss and learned to find strength in solitude. Margaret had worked with indigenous spiritual leaders, but Louise had modern understanding of psychological manipulation that helped her recognize and resist the entity's mental attacks. Most importantly, Margaret had fought to protect a community she had known all her life. While Louise fought for people she had chosen to care about despite their initial rejection of her, the Heartstone, the final component needed to activate the renewed seal, lay in the sacred bundle, pulsing within a light that grew brighter as the full moon reached its zenith. According to Margaret's notes, this stone was a piece of the mountain's spiritual core, and activating it would require the Guardian to channel her own life force through its crystalline structure. Louise lifted the Heartstone, feeling its weight both physical and spiritual. The moment she touched it, she understood the true cost of renewal. Not just her willingness to sacrifice her normal life, but her commitment to becoming permanently connected to the mountain's protective systems. The stone would bond with her life force, making her an integral part of the containment network. Even if you succeed, the entity hissed, its mental voice growing desperate as Louise prepared for the final ritual. You will become a prisoner as much as I am, bound to this mountain, watching over forces that will eventually consume you. Is protecting these ungrateful humans worth sacrificing your freedom? Louise placed the Heartstone in the center of the cracked seal, feeling power begin to flow through the ancient carvings as they responded to her touch. The sensation was overwhelming, like being connected to the mountain's deepest consciousness, feeling the weight of centuries and the patient endurance of stone and earth. Yes, she said aloud, her voice echoing through the chamber. It is worth it. The Heartstone flared with brilliant light as Louise channeled her life force into its crystalline structure. Pain shot through her body as the bonding process began, but she held steady, maintaining the connection even as she felt her individual existence beginning to merge with something far larger and more ancient than herself. The entity's screams of rage filled the chamber as the renewed seal began to take hold, its cracks healing as protective energy flowed through the restored channels. The malevolent presence that had pressed against Louise's mind throughout the ceremony was gradually pushed back, contained once again behind barriers strengthened by her willing sacrifice. The puppy's spiritual form blazed with approving light as he sensed the ceremony's success. The bond between guardian and guide was transforming along with the seal, becoming something that would endure as long as the mountain needed protection. As the Heartstone settled into its final position and the ancient seal completed its renewal, Louise felt the mountain itself acknowledging her sacrifice. She was no longer just a woman who had inherited a property and discovered family secrets. She had become the living heart of a protection system that would safeguard the valley for generations to come. The contained entity's presence faded to a sullen whisper as the strengthened barriers cut off its ability to influence the world above. The immediate crisis was over, but Louise understood that her real work as guardian was just beginning. The moment Louise activated the Heartstone, the mountain itself seemed to convulse with spiritual energy. The ancient seal blazed with renewed power, its cracks healing as protective symbols flared to life across its surface. But the contained entity wasn't surrendering without a final, desperate gambit. A sound like thunder rolled through the chamber as the malevolent presence gathered every fragment of remaining influence for one last assault. The entity couldn't break the renewed seal directly, but it could still reach beyond the chamber to corrupt the humans gathering on the mountain's surface. Through her new connection to the mountain's spiritual network, Louise felt the entity's influence surge upward, seeking the townspeople who had climbed to stop her ceremony. She sensed their confusion and fear as supernatural whispers filled their minds with visions of Louise as a dangerous cultist who had just unleashed disaster upon their community. "She's betrayed us all." Tom Bradley's voice echoed down from the surface, his words carrying the desperate conviction of someone whose protective instincts had been weaponized. "The whole mountain's shaking. She's brought down some kind of curse." Louise realized with horror that the entity was using the ceremony's own spiritual energy as proof of her supposed malevolence. To the corrupted townspeople above, the mountain's response to the renewed binding looked like confirmation of their worst fears about dangerous occult practices. The puppy's spirit form flickered with alarm as he sensed human footsteps approaching the mine entrance. Sheriff Reynolds and several other men were descending into the tunnel system, armed and determined to stop what they believed was an ongoing threat to their families. "I have to reach them," Louise said, her voice strained from maintaining the connection to the Heartstone. "The entity is using their love for the community as a weapon against the binding, but she couldn't abandon her position at the ancient seal. The renewal process required her constant presence for several more minutes, and any interruption could cause the entire ceremony to fail catastrophically. She was trapped between completing the most important task of her life and protecting innocent people from being turned into unwitting servants of the force she was trying to contain. The puppy made the decision for both of them. His spirit form blazed with ethereal light as he assumed a shape Louise had never seen before. Not the small, friendly companion she had known, but the ancient guardian spirit he truly was. His consciousness expanded to fill the chamber, and through their shared bond, Louise felt his plan forming. Instead of preventing the townspeople from reaching the heart chamber, he would guide them there, but not as enemies. The spirit puppy began projecting waves of purifying energy upward through the mind system, using the same power that flowed through the renewed binding network to break the entity's hold on their minds. Louise felt the moment when the entity's deceptions finally shattered. Through the mountain's spiritual network, she sensed the townspeople's confusion transforming into understanding as they realized they had been manipulated into opposing the very person trying to protect them. "Dear God," Sheriff Reynolds whispered as clarity returned to his thoughts, "what have we almost done?" The sound of running footsteps echoed through the tunnels as the group of men hurried toward the heart chamber, no longer as adversaries, but as people desperate to help complete a ceremony they had nearly sabotaged. Louise felt their approach through her connection to the mountain, sensing their genuine remorse and their determination to make amends. Tom Bradley was the first to reach the chamber, his flashlight beam revealing Louise kneeling beside the blazing ancient seal with the heartstone pulsing in her hands. The sight that greeted him defied every assumption he had made about her activities. Instead of dark ritual, he witnessed something that felt profoundly sacred and protective. "The whole mountain," he breathed, staring at the symbols carved into the chamber walls. "This is what your great-great-grandmother was protecting us from." Louise nodded without taking her eyes off the heartstone, which was reaching the critical phase of bonding with the renewed seal. "The entity tried to use you to stop me, just like it used you to damage the binding stones. It knows that turning good people against their protectors is more effective than any direct assault." Sheriff Reynolds approached carefully, his expression filled with shame and wonder. "Is there anything we can do to help? Any way to make up for what we almost prevented?" The puppy's spirit form settled beside Louise, his ancient wisdom flowing through their bond to provide the answer she needed. "Form a circle around the seal," she said. The entity draws power from isolation and division. If you stand together as witnesses to the renewal, your unity will strengthen the binding. The men arranged themselves around the chamber's perimeter, their presence transforming the space from a place of solitary struggle to a sanctuary supported by community commitment. Louise felt the difference immediately. The Heartstone's bonding process became easier, the ancient seal's restoration more complete. As human solidarity reinforced the spiritual barriers she was creating, the entity made one final attempt to break free, sending waves of despair and hatred through the chamber. But the combined strength of guardian, spirit guide, and community proved stronger than malevolent manipulation. The townspeople stood firm against psychological assault, their shared determination creating a barrier the entity couldn't penetrate. As the Heartstone settled into its final position and the ancient seal completed its renewal, the chamber filled with peaceful silence. The malevolent presence that had pressed against their consciousness throughout the ceremony was gone, contained once again behind barriers that would hold for generations. Louise felt the transformation completing itself. She was no longer just a woman who had inherited family property but had become the living guardian of forces that required eternal vigilance. The mountain acknowledged her sacrifice and service, welcoming her into a fellowship of protectors that stretched back through centuries of human history. The men around the chamber stood in respectful silence, understanding that they had witnessed something far greater than they had imagined possible. Their presence during the ceremony's completion had made them not just witnesses but participants in the renewal that would protect their community for decades to come. 6 months had passed since the night of the binding renewal, and Louise stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning mist lift from the valley below. The view was the same as always, pine trees stretching toward distant peaks. The town of Cedar Ridge nestled in its hollow like a collection of toy buildings, but everything about her relationship to this landscape had changed. The puppy, now permanently visible in his spiritual form, sat beside her with the patient dignity that had become his constant demeanor. Their bond had deepened during the ceremony into something that transcended normal companionship, becoming a partnership that connected Louise not just to her guardian duties, but to a network of protectors she was only beginning to understand. Through that network, she had learned that her great-great-grandmother's work was part of a much larger tapestry of protection. The guardians maintained their own vigils in locations scattered across the globe, each watching over contained forces that posed threats to human civilization. The renewed binding at Cedar Ridge had strengthened the entire network, earning Louise recognition and support. From guardians she would never meet but whose work paralleled her own, the journal she was writing had evolved from a simple record of guardian activities into something more comprehensive, a guide that would help future generations understand not just the practical aspects of maintaining the containment, but the deeper purpose that gave meaning to the sacrifice. Unlike Margaret's private documentation, Louise's journal was intended to be shared with community members who now understood their role in supporting the mountain's protection. Doc Peterson visited every Tuesday, bringing news from town and serving as an unofficial liaison between Louise and the valley's residents. The veterinarian had become one of her strongest allies, his medical background helping him understand the psychological aspects of spiritual protection, while his long history in the community gave weight to his endorsement of Louise's role. The Henderson families moving back from Denver, he reported during his latest visit, settling into the chair that had become his customary spot at Louise's kitchen table. Young couple with 2 small children. Tom Bradley says it's the first time in 20 years that people have moved to Cedar Ridge instead of away from it. Louise smiled as she poured coffee for both of them. The economic revival had been one of the most unexpected consequences of the successful binding renewal. With the entity's corrosive influence fully contained, the chronic depression that had plagued the valley for decades was lifting. New businesses were opening, property values were rising, and young families were choosing to stay rather than seeking opportunities. Elsewhere, Mrs. Chen asked me to tell you that the library board approved her proposal for a local history section, Doc Peterson continued. She wants to create a permanent display about the mountain's guardian traditions, though she's being careful to present it as folklore rather than documented fact. The delicate balance between education and secrecy remained one of Louise's ongoing challenges. The entity's near success in manipulating the community had demonstrated the dangers of complete ignorance, but revealing too much about the supernatural threat could create new problems. They had settled on an approach that preserved essential knowledge within the framework of local legends and family stories. Sheriff Reynolds had proven instrumental in maintaining that balance. His experience with the entity's corruption had left him uniquely qualified to recognize signs of supernatural influence while helping other community members understand their role in supporting spiritual protection without requiring them to believe in forces beyond normal comprehension. The monthly community meetings are working well, Louise told Doc Peterson. People understand that certain areas of the mountain should be respected and protected, even if they don't know all the reasons why. It's enough to prevent casual interference with the binding sites. The approach had created a new relationship between Louise and the town, not the isolation her great-great-grandmother had experienced, but a different kind of connection based on mutual support and understanding. She was no longer just a widow seeking solitude on a remote mountain, but a valued community member whose work enabled others to live without fear. The physical demands of guardian duties had proven manageable once. Louise understood the rhythms of spiritual maintenance, monthly visits to the binding stone locations, seasonal ceremonies to strengthen the containment network, and daily meditation sessions that kept her connected to the mountain's protective systems had become as routine as her writing work and household maintenance. More challenging were the psychological aspects of permanent guardianship. Louise had accepted that her life would be defined by solitude and service, but she discovered that meaningful purpose transformed isolation from burden into privilege. She was no longer alone on the mountain. She was connected to ancient forces and contemporary allies in ways that filled even the quietest hours with significance. The spirit puppy had become her bridge to understanding that larger connection. Through him, she could sense disturbances in the containment network, communicate with the mountain's deeper consciousness, and access wisdom from previous generations of guardians. His presence ensured that she would never face the complete isolation that had challenged earlier protectors. Winter evenings brought visits from townspeople who had become genuine friends, rather than casual acquaintances. Tom Bradley often stopped by with supplies and conversation, his family having become surrogate relatives, who ensured Louise never lacked for human companionship. Mrs. Chen visited monthly to share stories about the valley's history and help Louise understand her role within the broader context of community traditions. As spring returned to the mountain, Louise reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by a simple act of kindness toward a small animal she had found on a mountain road. She had thought she was rescuing a lost puppy, but in reality, the puppy had been rescuing her, awakening her to a purpose that gave her loss meaning and her solitude value. The entity beneath the mountain remained contained, its malevolent whispers silenced by barriers that would hold for generations to come. The binding stones maintained their protective network. The ancient seal pulsed with renewed strength, and the Heartstone's connection to Louise's life force ensured that the mountain's guardian system would continue functioning with human wisdom and supernatural power working in harmony. Louise had begun documenting not just guardian procedures, but the deeper philosophy that sustained protective work across generations. The journal would serve as both practical manual and spiritual guide for whoever inherited the responsibility after her, ensuring that future guardians understood not just the methods but the meaning of their service. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Louise could feel the mountain itself acknowledging her dedication, an ancient consciousness that had watched over the valley long before humans arrived and would continue its protection long after they were gone. She was no longer a woman living alone on a mountain, but a guardian whose life had become part of something far greater and more enduring than individual existence. The morning mist had cleared completely, revealing Cedar Ridge in sharp detail far below. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in yards, and the normal activities of a small community continued under the protection of forces most residents would never need to understand. Louise found deep satisfaction in that ordinary peace, knowing that her extraordinary sacrifice had made such normal happiness possible. The spirit puppy pressed against her leg, offering comfort and sharing her contentment with the life they had built together. Their partnership would continue as long as the mountain needed protection, and Louise had learned to see that permanent commitment not as limitation, but as the highest form of freedom. The liberty that comes from finding one's true purpose and dedicating everything to its fulfillment.